and welcome everyone to Insights. I'm Nnamdi Odikpo.
And I'm Elizabeth Omori. Thank you for joining us.
Today, a lot more people around the world choose their leaders by choice through the ballot box rather than other non-representative means. And yes, there are lots of positive democratic development around the world, yet the threats remain. We will be talking all about that in my first conversation on this episode, and if time permits, would also consider the critical issue of curbing elder abuse in Nigeria. For that, I will be engaging an advocacy rights officer on the issue. How about you, Elizabeth?
Yes, this week nations are raising awareness on the impact of hate speech. So we will be looking at the impact of this act on individuals, groups, and nation, as well as strategies to curbing the act.
Very well then, let's kickstart the program.
Whatever the issues are,
the National Assembly is constitutionally empowered to scrutinize.
However complex or intricate.
We have involved all the academia, the members of the academia. We have involved the academies.
Be it government's policies or in fact any issue of public concern.
Our job is to help you gain clarity and make sense of it all.
This is not really healthy for our democracy.
There's a lot of agreements in terms of who has been in power longest and who becomes the governor of the state.
It's also in the quality of food being consumed.
After all, perception is insight.
And gaining understanding is also getting insight.
So I reckon a lot of you watching would acknowledge that any inference at all on healing presupposes that something is wrong. Of course, there can be no healing if there is no sickness or illness, as it were. So I guess within the context of our conversation, or the subject matter of my first conversation, the real question is democracy healed? And I'm not just talking about democracy in Nigeria. I think it's much larger than that. I'm talking about the global state of democracy and maybe why we see certain practices also playing out in our own democracy here in Nigeria. So why we celebrate the gains of democracy, isn't it also concerning to be wary of the threats and to constantly rise in defense of democracy? Well, let me introduce my guest, Hamzat Lawal, activist and grassroots campaigner. He's also the founder of Connected Development Code and Follow the Money. Hamzat, thank you so much for joining me on Insight.
Well, thank you for having me, and good morning, viewers.
Great to have you here. I'm sure you followed my introduction where I laid out the paradoxical states of global democracy. You know, while witnessing alarming erosions, you know, we're also seeing gains in certain parts. You know what, Hamzat? As a teenager myself, I recall the euphoria, you know, the optimism, you know, that followed the Berlin Wall, the downing of the Berlin Wall, the end of the Cold War. And I'm sure a lot of people still, you know, recall and remember that same feeling of optimism and hope that trailed the end of apartheid in South Africa. These were all indicative of democratic gains and sparked that global sense of euphoria, you know, on democracy's march forward. So now we're looking at, or rather now we're talking in terms of democratic erosions. And, you know, beyond isolated cases, do you think some of these symptoms that we're seeing play out globally, symptoms like declining trust in institutions, symptoms like normalized executive overreach, you know, things like weakened checks and balances, and even attacks on electoral integrity, if these symptoms are systemic, you know, or systematic, or do you think it's just a phase and that democracy might just be experiencing temporary setbacks globally?
I think you also forgot to mention the Arab Spring and how
it
also brought about change, you know, in the Gulf region. I think that democracy itself is still evolving. If you follow the history of politics and democracy, and what we're experiencing now is that evolution of democracy, because now you have a new crop of generation, more younger people, and some of them are going to be first-timers. Some of them are already turning 18. Some of them have never cast their ballot. And I think one of the gap, and why democracy is still evolving, is one of the gap is sadly, we don't take history as important as we used to take it. And I think this is one thing that has really affected how democracy evolved and how different players and actors, because you see, when you talk about democracy, judiciary plays a role. And we're talking about global politics now. We've not brought it home.
Yes.
You know, judiciary plays a role. Citizens themselves play a role. Now you have platforms which are political parties, either you're a Democrat, you're a Republican, far left, far right. Media plays a role. We want to set agenda, to educate, to inform. But also we've seen where media houses and you know, the boards of these media houses that you call editorial boards are also taking position, either aligning with far left or far right. We're also seeing security, because security also informs what happens in a democracy. And this is globally, you know. But we also need to understand that when we talk about, you know, global politics and democracy globally, it's also about perception around who are the actors, who are the players, you know, how are they using their soft power or real power to influence economy, influence access to, you know, materials, and we're talking about natural resources here, but also their influence even at the UN level, now the regional blocks, the AU level. And when you even talk about the regional blocks, you're talking about global north, global south. You're also talking about race, the Arabs, you know, the black, you know, the white, even the red, you know. So again, all of this if informs, you know, the global politics, the global political landscape, you know, who are aligning, who are on the fence, you know, and who is actually taking position, either left or right. And I think that the exciting part about all of this conversation is it is only democracy that respects the right of people. And in the eyes of democracy, everyone is equal, where you have the right to vote for who would lead and govern your country, who would govern various institutions or various arms of government, legislative arm or the executive arm. And you know, when you also talk about democracy, what are we practicing? You have the presidential system. You have, you know, in the UK, they practice the parliamentary system.
Yes.
Even if you go back to Nigeria's history, at some point, we're practicing the parliamentary system of government. So again, democracy itself will continue to evolve. Even globally, before, you know, the end of the, you know, the Cold War, the World War II, before we now have a new pact under the United Nations where countries signed treaty and embraced peace. Even as we even speak, democracy is also still evolving. There is now fight, you know.
But this evolution you talk about, and earlier on you talked about certain dynamics. You talked about media ownership, threw in a couple of other issues into the mix. So is our democracy or our democracies around the world responding to these, some of these dynamics that you've talked about? Would you give us perhaps an example or two?
So in some climb, democracy is playing catch up. Citizens have gone ahead, and now, you know, the country itself are now playing catch up to democratize some of the system and process. Let me give you one quick example.
So the changing times.
Yes,
the
artificial intelligence. Yes, artificial intelligence is now we're trying to democratize AI. AI has already come, it has stayed, and now a lot of government, a lot of countries, a lot of actors are trying to play catch up. In other climes, you need to push them. You know, you need to push citizens. You need to educate them. You need to inform them so that they are well aware, they are informed. Because again, citizens must play a part. They must play a role before you get there. And you know, you talked about trust. Yes, globally there's a trust deficit. Both in multilateralism, in government, in international politics, there is that lack of trust. Because people always argue, democracy has not been able to ensure that it provides the dividends of democracy. Citizens around the world, you know, there is that apathy. There is that, you know, restiveness that, oh, we're not getting jobs. You know, our tax money, what is it being used for? How are we funding development in developing countries, sub-Saharan Africa, you know, and even Southeast Asia? You know, what kind of partnership have been informed before now? How is our relationship between Africa and China, our relationship between the US and even the EU and Africa? You know, so is that all this conversation, but we all agree there is deficit in trust.
I was going to say that, yes, public trust deficit wasn't the only issue I talked about. I also did talk about weakened checks and balances, talked about the very issue you were just going to talk about towards the end, or rather you highlighted towards the end of your commentary, weakened institutions as well. So let me bring it home now. And, we, here on NTA, we conducted a poll recently, on June 12, we polled Nigerians on how, they are prioritizing change, what we described as the change we need in our democracy. Our result was rather interesting, fascinating what we saw, play out at the end of the day. There was a clear mandate for transparent and credible elections with about 45.4% choosing comprehensive electoral reforms. I should say very quickly here that we had 4 options for respondents to choose from. So why 45.4 chose electoral reforms, 31% of our respondents demanded more active roles beyond voting, of course, insisting, on increased citizens' participation in democracy. Another 16.9% thought that parties, must define their core beliefs, choosing clearly defined ideologies. This percentage of respondents chose that internal party ideology, or rather party ideology, clearly defined party ideology as their option. And then finally, the last group, which was about 6.7%, chose stronger internal party democracy, of course, reflecting their own concern over the candidate selection processes in Nigeria. So clearly, Nigeria's electoral democratic experience, that we've talked all about with some of these elements, or rather, all of these elements that I've mentioned are critical elements, for democracy, not just in Nigeria, but in any nation, as it were. And they are also integral to engendering the growth of democracy. I should also mention that, yes, all of these cannot work in isolation. NTA also understands that, yes, in creating these options, we know that each must reinforce the other, but that is what the people chose. My question now to you, I haven't laid out this scenario and, told you about the outcome of our polls. Why do you think that is the case, that Nigerians would overwhelmingly, pick expansive, extensive electoral reforms as the option that they think we should pay more attention to in our democratic, space?
You see, the foundation of every democracy is election. Because before you have a government in place, there's a process. Of course, it starts with the political party that creates a platform. And, today in our constitution, it does not allow for independent candidacy. So everyone must vie or run under the political party, be the ruling or the major opposition party. So I can understand why. Also, if you look at pre-2023 election, 2023 election and post-2023 election, there was a lot of interest. We saw a lot of young people get registered. We saw a lot of people come out to cast their ballots, even if data has shown that, it was one of the least turnout of votes that we've had since our Fourth Republic. But everyone have now understand and agree that the foundation of our democracy that would ensure that we enjoy the dividends of democracy must start with elections. And that's why they're clamoring for electoral reform. And what are people saying? They say we want to see a more open and more transparent electoral process that endangers trust and that ensures that the will of the people and the vote of the people really count. Because mind you, election itself is collectively taking our mandate, our vision and aspiration, and entrusting it on individuals that would lead institutions, that will come about public policy, that will deal with budget, that will deal with releases and appropriation, and ensure that this money moves, to various communities to provide access to road, access to water, access to healthcare, access to education, to the Nigerian people at a large scale. Because again, yes, you might get intervention from different partners, but nobody can take the role of government, and people have now understand. And of course, with the work that NTA is doing to sensitize and raise awareness, people now understand that, you see, that electoral reform, it is very important and is central to how we can strengthen our very young and emerging democracy. And I see a lot of people will say, why would Hamza say this democracy is young? This is just 26 years. I think people forget that this is our Fourth Republic. A lot of people mistake it for independence. No, yes, we've gained our independence for over 60 years. But this democracy is 26 years. That's why I say it's young, and it's still evolving, and it's still emerging. And the beauty of it is, now there's an opportunity for actors to engage, to integrate, and ensure that we play our role. Because again, for it to continue to be strengthened and grow, each and every one of us must play our role. So before even the election itself, there are processes, there are systems and structures that must be put in place. So again, it's important that this poll actually has touched the pulse of the Nigerian people, and this speaks to even people that were not even exposed to casting their, or putting forward, their own submission on the poll. I want to also touch on internal party democracy, because you see, when you look at our political party, and this is a big concern, because one, what is their ideology? Today in America, you have Democrats and you have Republicans. So for us, we need to
clearly defined.
Yes. Are you a socialist party?
And a group in the middle, the independent.
Oh, the independent. So are you a socialist party? Are you a capitalist party? What are those your ideologies that ties to the fabric of your political party? Because we've seen cases where people decamp or abandon their political party and then go and realign. Yes, it's okay in politics to always align and realign, but let's see those core values that define what your political party is, so that this will give a clear cut. So when even electorate wants to determine their choices, because on our ballot paper, you don't see the candidate's name, you see the party logo.
The party's name,
yeah, you see the abbreviation on their logo. Yeah. So you're voting for the party. So again, if we have stronger internal party democracy, even how the candidates emerge, because this also endangers our leadership recruitment process. It starts with the political party, the platform itself. So how does this candidate emerge? Do every member of your party play a role, or you're using stakeholders, which is indirect votes, and you're getting delegate system? And then how do we take away money? Because again, one thing Nigerian people want to see, we've seen the clamor of transparency and accountability. How do we take away money out of our politics, out of our party system, out of our democracy? Because for us to enjoy the dividends of democracy, if the money bags continue to play a critical role, then that's why, and when you see abandoned projects, and I give it up to our anti-corruption agency, particularly in the Independent Corrupt Practices and Other Related Offences Commission, and how they have now focused on constituency projects and ensuring that we reduce, the abandoned project that we have. But again, internally, we must embrace this fiscal accountability and transparency, review our leadership recruitment process, but reform our electoral process so that we can build trust. Before 2023 election, you see how people came out en masse to get registered. You see how people came out to collect their permanent voters card. So we want to build on all of these wins and gain. But
that didn't translate to
the people
the numbers that we saw on election day.
Yes, to the turnout. But I believe that, again, this has shown that there is a gap. But in as much as there's a gap, this has shown there's opportunity. Where do we need to focus our messaging, focus our approach, and ensure that that collective voice bring about that reform we want to see in the electoral process, so that as we go into 2027, we go with trust, we go with confidence, and the Nigerian people would ensure that they vote. And you see, I say vote always counts, because if vote does not count, politicians will not bring out money to say they want to buy votes.
I'm sorry, you threw in money bags in politics at some point in your analysis, and I think we certainly cannot or should not ignore, some of the contemporary manifestations that threaten democracy globally. And I mean manifestations like extreme inequality resulting in the capture of politics by elites, and persistent corruption that continues to rob ordinary citizens of the right to better quality of life. So let's bring that home. You talked about our democracy being young, 26 years into democratic rule in Fourth Republic, Nigeria. But I'd like to ask you, to what extent do you think key democratic institutions, maybe INEC, maybe the judiciary, maybe the legislature, and even anti-corruption agencies like you just alluded to, how have they developed genuine independence and capacity towards resisting the issue you raised, money bags, resisting capture by powerful individuals or even the executive?
I think first is, as a country and as a system that we practice, what are our values? Because you see, let's tell ourselves the truth. We've lost our values. I remember when I was young and I'm growing up, I cannot just take anybody's toy from school and come home. My parents would ask me, where did you get this from? My parents would punish me for bringing someone's property into the house and would tell me, oh, you see that I'm not contented anymore. But today we see society have gone extremely bad, where younger people would acquire properties and, rather than ask them, people are celebrating them. So first, there's a breakdown of, values and the fabric of our society. Now, the money bags. The money bags are even contractors that government have given contracts to and have mobilized them. And they found a way, or they found a gap in the system whereby they give kickbacks and don't implement the contract or use of standard project materials. And in other words, have this project dilapidated or even completely abandoned. We've seen, sadly, where today we have stronger men and women rather than stronger institutions. And I think that when, you mentioned the parliament, that's the National Assembly. We know that without the legislative arm of government, this would not be a democracy, because they're the ones who effectively checkmate the excesses of the executive. I am glad that today there's some, stable relationship between the parliament, or the members of parliament, and the executive arm. But in as much as they have that cordial relationship, there must be very clear, strict checks and balance. And now the judiciary, you see, the judiciary is the one that guarantees the right of every ordinary person, where people can go and get justice and ensure that their rights are protected. So in a system where you have judicial corruption, that is even worse than murder itself. Because if the judiciary is corrupt, it means that it's anyone that has the money bags, or that is strong, or that can capture institution, or that can control security, that will now determine what becomes the outcome. That is very dangerous for any and every democracy. And I think that Nigeria has taken cue. Yeah. And why I'm focused on history, because again, yes, I studied political science, but I have keen interest in politics, public policy, and history. If we see what's happening across the West African region, even some of our neighbors, today we have some military juntas. And when you go on social media, sadly, you see young people who are clamoring and who are agitating. And for me, I see them as they're not informed, they're not aware, they've not read history. The worst form of democracy is better than any form of military rule. Because today we're enjoying freedom of speech, we're enjoying freedom of expression, we're enjoying freedom of association. We can contribute, we can go and get registered, we can vote. In military, it is decree. And I think that there's an opportunity here to continue to educate people. But again, I see that leadership, that how President Tinubu have carried himself and how he has used ECOWAS and how he has also used diplomacy. And I believe that in as much as our democracy is young and evolving, we can play a critical role in the Agenda 2063 for African Union, but also the sub-region ECOWAS, where we are prominent and where we can really influence things. But most importantly, democracy is here to stay. I'm glad that our armed forces have also put their weight on democracy, and we must continue to galvanize support, particularly using messages, key messages to younger people and younger generation, because they did not experience military rule. I was a small boy when, we had military rulers, and I could remember the trauma of, my neighbors, older people around me, and the entire complaint. But today, people can express themselves freely. So again, yes, our democracy is young, is evolving, but most importantly, we as citizens must ensure that institutions remain independent, institution takes precedent and protects the rule of law and engenders how we can reduce inequality, because the role of government is to ensure that this very scarce and limited resources is used effectively to provide service delivery for the ordinary people that are even hard to reach in various communities across Nigeria.
Speaking generally, but of course still within the context of our conversation, it is clear that democracies rarely die these days in coups, anymore. Now they erode step by step. An example is chipping away, at judicial independence, or even marginalizing opposition. And you know what? Let me take you to President Bola Tinubu's address. I'm sure you followed that. It was the address to the joint session of the National Assembly on June 12th to mark the Democracy Day. In fact, in talking about free speech, civil liberties, and political opposition, the president acknowledges that opposition cannot and should not be silenced. Maybe I should quote a session of that address where he said, "We must be vigilant in expanding the political space. We must always value dialogue over dictatorship, persuasion over suppression, and right over might. Be tolerant and broad-minded in your legislative action regarding speech and civil liberties." End of quote. In fact, my question to you is this: what remains to be seen? If this is already an acknowledgement that doing otherwise amounts to democratic backsliding.
I think first I must commend the president. The president is not even acting like someone who is now implementing his first term. The kind of reform that he's brought is people who have, gotten their second term that would take those bold steps, regularizing the FX, removing fuel subsidy, and, taking very hard decisions that are impacting, the country at large, where it would take time for us to start seeing the effects. But when you listen to his speech, he spoke like a nationalist. And knowing that he came from opposition, he also made commitment to guarantee the right of opposition. And he alluded that, no, we cannot practice a one-party state. And I think this is commendable for him, even if we have a lot of people defecting to his party. But he's still saying, go and put your house in order. And he cannot help you do it. He's not a member of opposition. Now he's in the ruling party. But I like the fact that he also made strong commitment to protecting the civic space, guaranteeing freedom of speech and expression. And he has said, if you like, call me names. I would guarantee your freedom, your protection to call me names, because this is a democracy. It's exciting to hear that, from, the father of the nation and the leader of the nation. That's great. And I hope that subnational government, and I mean state governors, local government chairmen, who thinks that they are above, some of them think they are above the law, should take a cue from Mr. President. If the president of the country is saying, if you like, call me names, I will still protect you and guarantee your right to express yourself freely, then that shows leadership. And I like how he also granted pardon to, some of the people that is so very, that's showing that, he's a leader of everyone. He's not a leader of any region, rather a national leader who wants peace to reign and who has embraced peace and want other people to start healing. Because you see, the Ogoni people have not healed over the years. Now they can start healing and integrating themselves into the nation building that we're clamoring for. And you see, he gave posthumous award to some people. He recognized even people from opposition, from the opposition of government, and giving them national honor and national award. So this really, even
it's media, intriguing to see an activist like yourself begin to almost talk like the government mouthpiece. But of course, what it means is, in democracy, when there's something to applaud, then you should applaud. When there's something to critique, then you should critique. I mean,
absolutely.
Unfortunately, we're totally out of time. Time flies, like they say. I had wanted us to talk a whole lot more on democracy as a global standard and, the vacuum of leadership when it comes to defending democracy, as it were. Because if we were to say there's a global standard for democracy, it therefore suffices to say that there's also a global dimension to defending democracy. But is there an absence in leadership, in global leadership for democracy? Of course, I know that you already suspect that I'm talking about that city, that country that describes itself as the city on the hill, and the seeming happenings in the United States, and whether that has contributed to, the speculated vacuum that we're talking about. But maybe we'll leave that for another day and, another time when we have the opportunity to bring you on the program to talk some more on the global state of our democracy. I'd like to thank you so much, Amzat Lawal, activist, grassroots campaigner, founder of Connected Development, and That's Code, of course, and Follow the Money. Thank you so much for your thoughts on this issue. As always, it is a delight having you on the NTA. It is a delight having you on Insight. This is actually your first time on Insight.
Yes, it
is. But of course, you're a regular on NTA.
Yes, and I look forward to coming back. Thank you for having me, and please let us support the Reserve Seat for Women bill. Let's integrate women into our democracy, our politics, and governance architecture to inspire more women into public office so they play their role, they add their own quota to our very young and emerging democracy.
Very well then. Thank you so much for coming on the program.
Thank you for having me.
Moving on, why Nigeria prides itself on deep-rooted value of respect and, care for senior citizens and elders, we still see a disturbing trend, which is abuse of older citizens. In fact, a systematic review polled a prevalence of elder abuse across multiple studies in Nigeria and pegs it at 46.73%. That is disturbing. Let me bring in my guest at this point, Reverend Victoria Onu. She is from the Coalition of Societies for Rights of Older Persons in Nigeria, COSRAPIN. Is that right? Is that the
COSRAPIN?
COSRAPIN, that's right. That's the acronym for this Coalition of Civil Societies for Rights of Older Persons in Nigeria. I'd like to welcome you to the program. Thank you so much for coming on Insight.
Thank you.
How do we now explain this cultural contradiction that we see, playing out in our society, respect for the elderly, for elders, and yet we see abuse of elders in a society like ours? Is it, or is there some dangerous disconnect between our proclaimed values, and actual familiar practices that we see play out these days in Nigeria?
Well, you just answered the question. The thing is that Nigeria has never seen this level of poverty ever. And it's produced a lot of psychological effects on people and social disorder. So you find out that a lot of people do not know how to handle the situation. Remember that we used to be more clustered than this. So now, you have people living in isolation from families. So having help is not easy. And because most of the people have migrated to the cities, a few are left in the rural areas to take care of these older persons. And because they are left, they are frustrated. The whole idea is, why must I be the one to be left behind? So they take it out on the older persons they have to take care of.
Their frustration. I
Yes.
mean, you say, when you said that we used to live in clusters, the sense that I got is that, culturally, we used to be communal.
Yes.
Living in
Exactly.
in communities and within closely knitted cycles. And do you think perhaps the issue of globalization and the fact that people are having to migrate is part of the challenge, and maybe some of the culture that we're also acculturating to might also be part of the challenge as well for some of what we see play out
In
these
fact,
days?
those are huge challenges because, for instance, people won't consider nursing homes and old people's homes a few years ago.
Back in the day, right?
Yes.
I mean,
but
that is an Oyibo culture.
Yes, but remember that people are now imbibing the Oyibo culture, really imbibing it, and people are becoming more self-centered in terms of their families are more of nuclear now than we used to have. The African culture was like very enlarged, so you can have uncle, auntie, and all that living in your home. But today it's not like that. People are becoming very nuclear-minded, just you, the person, and their wife. And I've had situations where people have been brought, because I run a home, so I've had situations where somebody has been brought to a lady has been brought to my home because the wife of the husband does not want the husband's mother in the home.
House. You've talked about the economics of family, sustaining a family, whether immediate or extended, but especially the extended family that now captures, your elders, your aged parents and all of that. With this high youth unemployment, or maybe let me say the economy strain that most families, are undergoing, caring for elders, like you've said, can actually be cumbersome, burdensome. You know, it could be a very difficult, hard responsibility for them. Potentially also fueling neglect or resentment in some cases. How can we as a people, as a community with deep-rooted values for respect for older persons, for our elders, how can we, you know, reconnect with this value? Perhaps foster genuine, you know, intergenerational solidarity, you know, to reframing elder care as a duty now, you know, as a duty now rather than, you know, something else, rather than just a loss for money or something.
I'm sorry to disappoint you, but the pocket has a lot to do with it.
So what can we do?
Well,
because we cannot say...
We can begin by what we are doing now, advocacy.
Advocacy.
Yes. But at the same time, we need to be more intentional. For instance, you find out that in weddings today, you can't find a lot of older persons. So we need to be more intentional about making socialization inclusive of the older person. So you are going to church or mosque, make sure you pick up your grandfather or your father. You're going to a wedding. They may be slow. They may be not easily, they may not tag along with you so easily. They may make you late. But be intentional about including them in those activities. And if we're not intentional about not leaving them behind, I'm sorry, there's nothing anybody can do about it in the next 15 years. You won't see them in any social function. Transportation is not there. It's not easily accessible for them to do it by themselves. When it is expensive.
You know, there's something that I see play out and that frightens me sometimes. You know, it's not funny really, but the thing is, why does it seem like men are more susceptible or more vulnerable to elder abuse?
Men?
Yes, men, older men. Because it will seem like the children often are quick to take sides with the women, older women, their mother, and, you know, leaving the men at the mercies of you know.
Well, I'm glad you're asking this question.
On their own, because...
Sunday, yesterday was Father's Day.
Yes,
so
yes. Do you know how many men got gifts? If I give you the ratio of men who got gifts and compare it to the ratio of women who usually get gifts during Mother's Day, then you see the gulf and the gap that I'm talking about. So it brings me back to the question that why would it seem, or why does it seem that men are more susceptible, more vulnerable to elder abuse?
I think basically men should work on relationship. Yes, they are the breadwinners. So? Yes, they are the breadwinners, but they still need to put in some work in relationship with their children, because they focus so much on making this money, they don't make out time for memories. They don't make out time for family. So in the end, when the children leave home, all they have in their memory are their mothers. So men need to wake up. They need to begin to invest in those memories also. As an adult now, all you have, you left home, you didn't carry the cars in the home, you didn't carry the furniture, but you have your memories. And when you search your memory, you may not find a father in that memory. So how do you begin to take care of somebody who is not in your memory? So men need to wake up. They need to begin to invest in those memories. They need to make time for those children, and then as they grow up, you will see there will be a change.
You know, earlier on we started the conversation of how best to make, you know, caring for senior citizens, for the elders or the elderly, a mutually beneficial partnership, you know, between, you know, or amongst, let me say amongst, because I think government has a role to play here. So it goes beyond the family now. If the family, perhaps, okay, let's create another scenario. A family that is very close, very closely knitted, where the children are very close to their parents, they are well cared for when they were young. Doesn't it suffice? Isn't it therefore, shouldn't the situation be that when these same parents are now old and on the children, that the children this role should naturally reverse for the children to take care of their parents. But instead, what we now see is, because we're saying that, look, that we have 46.73% of elder abuse in Nigeria. That's almost half of 100%, and that is really disturbing. So is it that, look, families are fast losing these values, and as such, we're seeing some of these scenarios, negative, ugly scenarios playing out within families?
Yes, I agree that families are fast losing the values, but it is the fault of the older generation. Because the older generation, most of the things that our fathers did, we swore that most of the things that our fathers made us to go through, we decided that our children don't need to go through them. And then as they grew up, they kind of detached. I'll give you a typical example. When you talk about detachment, I have a friend whose children are very caring. And she said it's a result of always hammering to them that they owe her. You know, I would have used this money to buy myself a car, but I'm using it to pay for this expensive school. So when you grow up, you're going to do this, 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 this. But most of the generation that we are looking at now never did anything like that. It's like they expected them to suddenly know that they are supposed to do those things. And then they grow up not having responsibility, not believing that they owe anybody anything. And remember that this generation we are dealing with now are the selfie. They are the self-centered generation. So it will take a jolt for them to stop looking into themselves first and they start looking outside themselves.
I see what you did there, turning selfie to self-centered.
It's self-centered. I mean, 20 years ago, it would take a lot for you to take a picture of yourself.
True.
Or call your name.
True.
But today, you know what it is.
Reverend Victoria Onu, from the Coalition of Society for Rights of Older Persons in Nigeria. I'd like to thank you so much for coming on our program. What's your exact designation for your association? Are you the Secretary General? Fantastic. Secretary General, Coalition of Society.
Can I just say one thing?
Quickly.
I love what you're doing, and we need more people doing this. But because
Advocacy.
most older persons' cases or topics are really not trending, is there any way we can make it trending? Is there any way we can actually bring this conversation to everyday talk? So that the young people will be conscious. Today, they don't know anything about honor. Can we go back there and begin to talk?
Well, like you said, this is a collaborative venture. Everybody has a stake. We all need to come play our parts. The media, civil society, the government, everybody needs to, even the families, everybody needs to come together and play their own part to ensure that, look, awareness is raised on this issue, and that, you know, where we do see occurrences that are ugly, relevant authorities step in and then they address the issues. Once again, I'd like to thank you so much for coming, Reverend Victoria Onu. It's been a pleasure having you here on Inside. Thank you so much for coming on the program.
Thank you.
Elizabeth Omori is up next. She will be talking about something quite germane and equally important.
Hate speech is a harmful form of expression that can have severe consequences. It provokes violence, discrimination, and harm against targeted groups or individuals. As Nation Heighten Advocacy, this week, on this form of expression, we will look at causes and impacts. And my guest is a former commissioner for Information, Kebbi State, Amos Sakaba. He will speak to us. Thank you so much, sir, for joining us on Insights.
Thank you very much. It's my pleasure to be here.
Thank you so much. Now, is hate speech a careless form of expression or just intended to create chaos? Let's begin from there.
Yeah, thank you very much. I think it's both.
Okay.
It is born out of malice, carelessness also. And it is also can be used to convey, levels of the very opposite of unity and togetherness. So hate speech is actually what is used to, challenge the integrity of a person, the personality of the person. It challenges even the fabric of the unity of a country, taking advantage of some differences, that are natural in every society and using them as basis to intimidate and to fan embers of hatred and intolerance.
All right, this is more or less a tool of destruction. How do you see this tool in terms of radicalization of an individual?
In terms of?
Radicalization of an individual. Because
yes.
some use it as a weapon.
Yes. Actually, that is the most of part of what it is used for, because hate speech is actually, if you look at, I like to give a very good example.
Okay.
If, as Nigeria is, we are multi-religious, multicultural, multi-ethnic. If, for example, you take conversion from one faith to another faith and make it a media event to be celebrated in a platform where there are both Muslims, Christians, you are actually creating problem, because we have cases of conversions on both sides of the divide. So hate speech, what hate speech does is to create that mutual mistrust,
okay,
mutual suspicion, and insensitivity and intolerance.
Now, could this be the easiest way of attack? Let's take, for example, political parties.
Yeah, they are political parties by their nature. They are in the game of wrestling for political power. And of course, the season is approaching, so the tension will be heightened. The desperation is much more. But the idea is that whatever one does, it is the same people you hope or aspire to govern. Now, if you create serious crisis within the mistrust between the citizens and the politicians, it creates serious problems. And it can lead to lawlessness, and that will hamper development of whatever kind. So it is important that political parties understand that even if they are campaigning to support their own causes, they should be conscious that the people they are governed may not understand it as a political game. They may see it as an expression of deep-rooted commitment to annihilate the opponent.
Okay. All right, you know, Antonio Guterres once said, we must confront bigotry by working to tackle hate that spreads like a wildfire across the internet. Now, the internet is the easiest platform to promote this act, no doubt. So how can we counter hate speech on the internet, starting with the internet?
Yeah, thank you very much. I think that is even the easiest and fastest way of spreading or doing the hate speech. And I can see that it will be necessary, even without compromising the rights of people to express themselves and to listen to what other people's views are. It is important that some form of regulation be put in place, and mechanisms within the service provider themselves can help. With the artificial intelligence now, it is possible to actually regulate what comes on air or what comes on the internet. And by doing so, they are able to remove anything that is not in line with what will promote unity and togetherness of a people or a community or a country, or even internationally. So it is important that some form of regulation or inbuilt mechanism to control hate speech can be introduced by the service providers. And then government can, under the auspices of a very strategic communication system, can actually deliberately put policies and measures in place that will support and promote counter-narratives that the hate speech people are embarking on. You can also make yourself available for Nigerians to know the facts, for example. And then once they know the facts, they will compare it. This date is very common to say, if you hear any good news, they will say, have you heard it on NTA? Have you heard it on AIT? Have you heard? So the social media has taken over because people have access to it.
Yes.
There's no control, no regulation. So I think it is important that some form of very deliberate policy on the part of the government to regulate what is put on air without compromising the need for people to express themselves.
That's
So a kind of careful balance needs to be done.
Of course. You know, the psychological impact of this is actually grave. And then, shouldn't there be stringent laws to ensure that people are jailed or sentenced, even from the home front?
there will be need to have a legislation that protects citizens from bullies and other hate speech makers. It will also promote national development if we are able to do that. But the important thing is we need that careful balancing between regulation and allowing people to express themselves. It's a very careful balancing that needs to be done. But I think also under strategic communication, I don't know whether it's the Federal Ministry of Information or whatever agency of government that has responsibility for doing so, is to really, come up with guidelines that will support, and you can regulate easily if you handle the service provider themselves, than the individuals who have access to this TikTok and the rest. So I think there's a sense in which if people know that it's an offense, that's why educating people is important, and sending counter narratives. Let people be also bombarded with the true stories concerning issues. And also they need to unite the country, they need to tolerate each other, they need to support our diversity and move together as a nation. I think those are the kind of things that, and I think NDA is not lacking in that direction. But I think it is something that should be a deliberate policy of government to send counter narratives that will support the unity of this country, that will support tolerance to other people's differences within societies, and also to avoid attacking any ethnic group as part of self-aggrandizement.
Okay. Now, before I let you go, you mentioned freedom of expression. At what point do we draw the line between hate speech and freedom of expression?
Yeah, that is what that existing law says about defamation of character. You can sue anybody who defames you. If you feel strongly that your character has been defamed, you can sue the person. But of course, the legal processes, how long it will take. People are not ready to go through those stress and the rest. But I think there is a sense in which government can do that regulation. And that dividing line, like I said, is very, very narrow. And I think people should be responsible to know the implication of what they are doing and what that can lead them to. And once they know there are measures that will deal with infringements, I think it will come up better.
Okay. I noticed you mentioned a few minutes ago tolerance, the issue of religion, tribe, tolerance. Why do we find it very difficult to tolerate each other? Because if we do tolerate each other, there wouldn't be the need to speak ill of the other person. So how do we put a check on this? That's my final question.
Yeah, the issue of tolerance or lack of it is that people who embark on this in this hate speech, they are doing it out of trying to get political advantage or personal fulfillment in terms of seeing that other people are run down. But I think more to it is that the unity of this country is not negotiable. God has created us as a country with different religions, different ethnic groups, and there's nothing we can do about that now. We have to live with it, and we have to manage our diversity to bring about peace and stability and development. We need to allow level of tolerance, level of understanding of each other. Our knowledge of the differences is very crucial. Even if it means putting in the curriculum of our educational system, even if it means part of the orientation that National Assembly members will go through before they are sworn in, even if it means political appointees, when they are doing presidential retreat, emphasis should be laid on that. But I think the most important thing is for government to be able to reach out to people. Citizen engagement is very critical. And that this engagement can take all manner of forms. And once it is done, it brings and restores confidence of the citizens in terms of what government does or doesn't do.
Amos Sakaba, former Commissioner for Information, Kebbi State, I want to thank you so much for joining us on Insight.
Thank you.
And thank you for sharing your thoughts with us as we raise advocacy on the issue before us. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Just before we round off this episode, I'd like to say a few words. In our call to action for today, I'd like to say this. The constant need to defend democracy is as important as the need to celebrate its gains. It is itself a concerning symptom of the threat that constantly rears its head. And, why that may be the illness, it's also the essential treatment. Healing requires both honest diagnosis of the disease and an unwavering commitment to applying the remedies. In this instance, the remedies are strengthening relevant democratic and public institutions, rebuilding trust, combating disinformation, protecting rights, and upholding, or rather holding power accountable everywhere the democratic ideal is cherished. Let me say this, defending democracy is not a sign of strength. Rather, it is a necessary fight for the survival of democracy. And that's all for now on Insight. To join us same time next week for more on the program. My name is Nnamdi Odikpo.
And I'm Elizabeth Omori. We'll see you next week. Bye for now.